In the shadow of Amon Hen, where the great eye first turned its terrible gaze upon the fellowship, a different song began to weave itself through the threads of Middle-earth's destiny. Here, at the moment when all possible futures converged like tributaries meeting a vast river, we witness the path where unity held firm against the ring's first calculated assault upon their bonds. The Hill of Sight, which in familiar tellings became the Hill of Sundering, instead transformed into the Hill of Covenant, where 9 companions chose to face their burden collectively, rather than scatter like autumn leaves before the storm of individual temptation and fear. Boromir's confession, arriving before corruption could fully bloom into betrayal, created an unprecedented moment of shared vulnerability that fundamentally altered the ring's ancient strategy. The One Ring, that masterful corrupter of singular hearts, suddenly found itself confronting something its malevolent intelligence had never encountered. A collective will that refused to fracture under pressure, distributing its poison across 9 souls rather than concentrating its venom within one. Where the ring had perfected the art of whispering to isolated minds, exploiting private fears and secret ambitions with surgical precision, it now faced the complex harmonies of shared consciousness, forcing it to recalibrate its methods entirely. This choice, born from loyalty deeper than individual survival, introduced what Gandalf would later term the mathematics of collective burden, a spiritual arithmetic where the weight that might crush one becomes manageable when distributed among many, yet creates new vulnerabilities that individual heroism never encounters. The Fellowship's decision to maintain their bonds transformed the immediate crisis from personal moral collapse into communal trial, replacing the sharp agony of singular failure with the constant, subtle pressure of shared vigilance. Each member found their role redefined. Aragorn learning to suspend command, so space existed for healing dissent. Sam tending the small rituals that kept companions particular rather than merged. Merry and Pippin converting fear into levity that served as architecture against intrusion. The ring adapted with patient malevolence, abandoning its familiar offers of crowns to solitary dreamers in favor of subtler temptations suited to unified purpose. It began humming about efficiency, mercy expedited, victories multiplied through perfect coordination rather than secret sacrifice. Its most insidious promise being collective infallibility, the flattering suggestion that unanimous agreement proved righteousness, while dissent echoed enemy whispers. This distributed corruption, spreading like slow poison through the spaces between souls, created the weight of shared sight, where every flicker of temptation in one became perceptible, though unspoken, by all. Their first collective decision reached through daylight. Deliberation rather than desperate circumstance marked a profound departure from the canonical path. They would seek counsel together rather than risk the isolation that breeds both heroism and tragedy. This choice to approach their task as unified force rather than secret sacrifice rippled outward through Middle-earth's spiritual architecture, creating harmonies in the music of creation that had never been sung before. Before we can understand how their unprecedented unity would reshape the very foundations of their quest, we must first examine the deeper metaphysical principles governing collective will within Middle-earth's ancient design. Their choice to seek counsel together rather than scatter into shadow had introduced harmonies unprecedented within Middle-earth's ancient design, creating resonances that would challenge even the wise to interpret. To understand how their unified approach fundamentally altered their quest's nature, we must examine the deeper principles governing collective will within a world where the music of creation responds to mortal choices with cosmic consequence. Within Ada's spiritual architecture, individual will functions like a single voice singing against the vast symphony of existence, capable of remarkable beauty, yet limited by its solitary melody. When 9 distinct souls choose to harmonize their purposes completely, their combined intentions create what the LOTR term soul resonance, a phenomenon where unified will generate standing waves in the spiritual realm that amplify certain frequencies while creating interference patterns capable of silencing others entirely. The Fellowship's unprecedented unity began broadcasting their collective chord across Middle-earth's metaphysical landscape, making their shared thoughts audible to powers that normally perceived only the strongest individual voices, yet also creating blind spots where singular wisdom might have provided essential clarity. This resonance fundamentally transformed how the Ring's corruption could operate within their company, forcing the ancient evil to abandon strategies perfected across millennia of singular temptation. Where isolated whispers had once fed on private doubts and unwitnessed moments of weakness, the Ring now found itself compelled to work between minds rather than within them, suggesting that their very harmony made them stronger and therefore more worthy vessels for its power. Their shared vigilance, while protecting against familiar forms of betrayal, created new vulnerabilities as unanimous agreement could mask collective delusion, and their transparent decision-making process multiplied opportunities for patient influence during the extended deliberations that consensus required. More troubling still was the emergence of what would become known as the price of perfect harmony, the gradual erosion of creative tension that drives individual growth and wisdom. Their unity, while beautiful, began smoothing away the rough edges of personality that often provide friction necessary for development, transforming Aragorn's natural authority into constant consultation, Gimli's proud stubbornness into accommodation, and Sam's fierce independence into protective hovering that served collective needs while diminishing particular strengths. The world itself began responding differently to their amplified presence, smoothing paths and illuminating signs, while subtly dimming the solitary insights that had once guided wanderers through darkness. Their collective resonance created new patterns in fate's weaving, threads of possibility that had never existed in Middle-earth's long history, drawing other souls into their influence, like iron filings aligning with magnetic force. This phenomenon would prove most profound when they encountered those whose wisdom had been shaped by ages of contemplation, whose understanding of burden and sacrifice would be challenged by their unprecedented approach to heroism and unity. Their collective resonance had begun drawing other souls into their influence, creating patterns in fate's weaving that would challenge even ancient wisdom to interpret. When they entered the golden wood of Lothlorien, where starlight and memory intertwined in ageless dance, their unified presence registered immediately in the consciousness of one whose perception spanned the long years, whose understanding of burden and sacrifice would be tested by their unprecedented approach to heroism and collective destiny. Galadriel, keeper of Nenya, and guardian of time's deeper currents, perceived their arrival not as 9 separate melodies seeking individual counsel, but as a single, complex harmony that had never before echoed through the halls of her timeless realm. Her ancient wisdom, shaped by ages of guiding solitary seekers through personal darkness, found itself confronted by something entirely new, a collective consciousness that required forms of guidance no Eldar had ever needed to offer. The Lady of Light recognized that their unbroken bonds had introduced frequencies into the music of creation itself, resonances beautiful beyond measure, yet carrying implications that even her foresight struggled to encompass. The mirror of Galadriel, faithful revealer of individual fates and private struggles, found itself reflecting something unprecedented when their unified gaze fell upon its waters. Instead of showing scattered destinies and personal trials, the mirror revealed collective futures where their shared choices rippled outward like concentric circles, creating what she termed binding resonance, visions coupled together, scenes meant to stand apart now arriving as unified prophecy. She witnessed mirrors that showed what should not be seen together, moments where their very unity created new vulnerabilities, as the enemy learned to target not individual weakness, but collective strength turned inward upon itself. Within the Malorn groves, Galadriel's counsel took on unprecedented complexity, as she attempted to guide souls who had chosen to face their burden as one entity rather than as individuals capable of independent growth through solitary trial. Her words, traditionally offered to lonely hearts wrestling with personal shadow, now addressed a fellowship whose very strength might prevent the individual struggles that traditionally forged wisdom through separation and sacrifice. She spoke of songs that bind as well as free, warning that their unity, while protecting them from familiar corruption, created dependencies that might prove more limiting than the isolation they had avoided. Most troubling were her visions of futures where their collective approach prevented the personal transformations that adversity traditionally granted to sovereign hearts, showing realms where their example became both inspiration and impossible standard. She perceived that some forms of wisdom required the loneliness their fellowship had chosen to avoid. Some strength could only emerge through individual testing, and some growth demanded the particular trials that unity, however noble, might inadvertently circumvent through its very protective power. As they prepared to depart Lothlorien, carrying both her blessing and her unspoken concerns, the question that would follow them into realms where political power must reckon with their unprecedented unity remained suspended like morning mist. Whether their choice to remain together would ultimately serve or constrain the world they sought to save through collective will. The question of whether their unity would ultimately serve or constrain the world they sought to save followed them from Lothlorien's golden halls toward realms where political power would face its first test against their unprecedented collective will. When the Fellowship approached Edoras across the wide grasslands of Rohan, their unified presence created ripples that reached the Golden Hall before their footsteps touched its threshold, stirring something in the enchanted king that solitary intervention might never have awakened with such gentle certainty. Theoden, trapped within webs of sorcery that had slowly drained his will across months of whispered poison, found himself responding to their approach in ways that confounded both Saruman's distant influence and Gandalf's expectations. The mechanisms by which collective purpose disrupts magical manipulation revealed themselves as the Fellowship's shared intent created interference patterns that made the White Wizard's subtle domination suddenly unstable, like discordant harmonies disrupting a carefully maintained melody of control. Their ninefold unity began unraveling enchantments designed to isolate and diminish singular consciousness, proving that some spells lose their power when confronted not by individual resistance, but by the amplified resonance of unified will operating in perfect counterphase. Yet this easier liberation carried consequences that became apparent only as Theoden's restoration progressed without the personal struggle that traditionally forged wisdom through adversity and private battle against darkness. The king's recovery, while swift and seemingly complete, lacked the particular strength that comes from overcoming corruption through individual effort, creating what would become known as victories without cost, triumphs that heal surface wounds while leaving deeper vulnerabilities untouched by the transformative fire of earned redemption. Theoden found himself freed, yet somehow diminished, lacking the hard-won insights that personal battle against shadow traditionally granted to those who reclaimed their sovereignty through solitary courage rather than collective rescue. More troubling still was how Rohan's people began responding to the Fellowship's presence. Their collective legend already spreading across Middle-earth, like ripples from a stone cast into still water of expectation. The Rohirrim, witnessing their king's restoration through the mere approach of unified purpose, began looking to the Fellowship not merely for aid in their current crisis, but for continued guidance in all matters requiring wisdom and strength, creating new dependencies where the kingdom's traditional self-reliance began eroding beneath borrowed confidence. This transformation from rescue to reliance reshaped how Rohan understood its own capacity for self-governance, replacing internal struggle with external solutions that felt easier, yet left essential muscles of independence unexercised. As they prepared to continue their journey, the Fellowship recognized with growing unease how their very success had fundamentally altered the nature of leadership and responsibility wherever they traveled, creating precedents where collective intervention replaced individual growth, and outside unity solved problems that internal struggle might have transformed into lasting strength through personal trial and earned wisdom. Their recognition that success had fundamentally altered leadership and responsibility wherever they traveled marked the beginning of a more insidious burden that would test their unity through psychological pressures the Ring's corruption had never attempted. As their legend spread across Middle-earth faster than their footsteps could carry them, the Fellowship discovered the peculiar weight of becoming symbols while remaining mortal souls, finding that the distance between their authentic selves and others' desperate need for infallible heroes created a form of isolation more profound than any physical separation they had ever endured. The mechanisms by which heroic expectations reshape reality revealed themselves through countless encounters where their mere presence transformed ordinary moments into performances of their own legendary status. Innkeepers refused payment from those who had liberated kingdoms. Children gazed with reverent silence instead of natural curiosity, and seasoned warriors sought their blessing for decisions they would have made confidently alone, creating what they came to recognize as the architecture of expectation. Invisible structures that guided their words and gestures before conscious choice could intervene. Each member found their individual identity slowly dissolving into their collective image, as private struggles became public inspiration and personal bonds transformed into political symbols that others needed to believe in more than they needed to understand. Aragorn felt this pressure most acutely, discovering that his approaching kingship, while politically assured through their unified support, carried a hollowness that solitary struggle might never have created. His crown would rest upon shared strength rather than personal transformation, leaving him to wonder whether sovereignty granted through collective acclaim could ever match the depth of authority earned through individual trial and private victory over shadow. Legolas and Gimli's friendship, once a source of personal joy and mutual discovery, became a carefully maintained emblem of reconciliation that required constant performance of harmony, their spontaneous laughter gradually replaced by measured exchanges that reassured observers of ancient prejudices overcome through noble example. The hobbits bore perhaps the strangest burden, as their simple courage became proof that ordinary folk could accomplish extraordinary deeds, transforming their natural resilience into a responsibility they had never sought to represent universal truths about heroism and determination. Sam's protective instincts thickened into ceremonial duty, while Frodo discovered the peculiar mercy of being watched constantly, since external vigilance steadied tremors he preferred to hide. Yet he sensed the growing loneliness of being loved for what he symbolized, rather than known for who he remained, beneath the weight of others' hopes and fears. This phenomenon, which they privately termed the loneliness of the exemplar, created a paradox where their greatest triumph, maintaining unity against all odds, had separated them from the very world they had fought to protect, making them simultaneously celebrated and isolated, needed yet never truly seen for their authentic selves rather than their legendary roles. Their internal complexity would soon face its most penetrating test when they encountered wisdom capable of seeing through legend to perceive both the nobility and the hidden dangers of their unprecedented approach to collective heroism. Their internal complexity, born from the loneliness of the exemplar, would soon face its most penetrating test when they encountered wisdom capable of seeing through legend to perceive the authentic souls beneath their celebrated roles. In the green shadows of Ithilien, where ancient gardens bloomed wild beneath Mordor's distant threat, Faramir's rangers discovered not two hobbits wandering alone with their terrible burden, but the complete fellowship moving as one entity through lands where secrecy had once offered their only protection against overwhelming surveillance and malice. This encounter fundamentally transformed the nature of the moral trial that Faramir had been destined to face, shifting his test from private temptation resisted in solitude to public examination conducted before witnesses whose very presence altered the ethical landscape entirely. The distinction between mercy granted in ignorance and mercy offered with full knowledge became the fulcrum upon which his decision balanced, as their transparency forced him to weigh not merely immediate compassion, but the broader implications of their unprecedented approach to bearing burdens that tradition suggested should remain hidden from all scrutiny. Faramir's discernment, sharpened by years of studying both enemy tactics and his own heart's capacity for corruption, immediately recognized that their openness represented both immense strength and subtle vulnerability in equal measure. Their refusal to employ deception or concealment had made them simultaneously more trustworthy and more exposed, since collective transparency created a single, highly visible target for those who might exploit their unity, for purposes that even shared wisdom could not always anticipate or prevent through coordinated vigilance alone. The mechanisms of honor and law in Gondor, built upon centuries of assuming individual heroism and private sacrifice, struggled to accommodate their collective accountability in ways that created legal and ethical precedents his father's court would find both inspiring and deeply troubling. Faramir understood that their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about how great deeds should be accomplished, whether through hidden sacrifice or public unity, and his decision to aid them carried implications extending far beyond their immediate mission to encompass questions about the nature of heroism itself. His careful questioning revealed the complexity of navigating between protection and duty as he sought to balance aid for these revered companions with his paramount obligation to safeguard Gondor from any unforeseen consequences of their unique approach to bearing world-altering responsibility. Faramir recognized that their presence, while offering unprecedented hope, also represented a profound disruption to established order, whose energies could either uplift or inadvertently destabilize the fragile peace he worked to maintain through traditional methods. As he granted them passage while warning of trials their unity would face in the White City, Faramir foresaw chambers where their collective heroism would encounter political forces that had learned to exploit not individual weakness, but the spaces between unified souls, testing whether their bonds could withstand scrutiny, designed to fragment even the strongest alliances through patient manipulation. Faramir's warning about trials their unity would face in the White City proved prophetic as the Fellowship approached Minas Tirith's seven-tiered citadel, where ancient stones had witnessed countless individual heroes, but never the sustained presence of collective legend made manifest in living form. Their arrival created unprecedented ripples through corridors that had been carved from mountains, where the music of creation still echoed faintly, awakening both fierce hope and subtle hunger in defenders who had grown accustomed to solitary sacrifice rather than unified strength operating as a single, harmonious entity. The mechanisms by which proximity to unified power amplifies not merely courage, but also desire revealed themselves immediately as their collective presence began resonating through the White Tower's foundations, making their shared thoughts audible to sensitive minds while broadcasting their emotional states across all 7 levels in ways that transformed private counsel into inadvertent public performance. Citizens who had endured months of siege through individual resilience suddenly found their scattered hopes coalescing around the Fellowship's unbroken bonds, creating formidable shields against despair, yet simultaneously generating intense scrutiny that left no private moment unobserved by anxious eyes seeking confirmation of legends. Denethor's reception embodied the complex tensions their presence generated throughout the realm, as the ruling steward found himself simultaneously grateful for their strength and deeply unsettled by the disruption their very existence represented to hierarchies built upon personal merit and inherited authority rather than chosen covenant. His ancient wisdom recognized that their collective approach challenged fundamental assumptions about how power should be earned and exercised, creating precedents that could either elevate Gondor's governance through inspired cooperation or undermine traditional structures through impossible standards of unified purpose that few could hope to replicate. The ring's influence adapted with characteristic patience to this new environment, abandoning its familiar whispers to individual hearts, in favor of suggestions that spread through political conversations and carefully planted doubts about whether their transparency made them manipulable, their unity made them predictable, and their nobility made them unsuitable for the complex moral compromises that effective governance required. These subtle corruptions found fertile ground in spaces between admiration and resentment, where their example simultaneously inspired and intimidated those who felt diminished by comparison to such perfect cooperation. Most troubling was their growing realization that maintaining unity had transformed them into a focal point for forces beyond their control, as various factions within the city began attempting to claim their endorsement for competing visions of Gondor's future, turning their presence from neutral aid into unwitting political influence that could destabilize the very realm they sought to protect through collective responsibility. Their greatest strength had become their most dangerous vulnerability, as the ring learned to exploit not individual weaknesses, but the spaces where unified purpose intersected with political ambition, preparing arguments about whether perfect cooperation might prove the sweetest snare of all. The ring's preparation of arguments about perfect cooperation being the sweetest snare revealed how corruption itself had evolved, abandoning millennia of proven individual temptation in favor of subtler approaches that worked between souls rather than within them. While the Fellowship's collective vigilance had successfully prevented the dramatic betrayals that solitary corruption traditionally fostered, their very transparency created new pathways for influence that operated through the spaces where unified thoughts intersected, finding purchase not in private weakness, but in the mechanisms of shared decision-making itself. The distinction between distributed corruption and concentrated temptation became apparent as the ring learned to address their group identity rather than individual desires, suggesting that their unprecedented unity proved their worthiness to wield power that lesser alliances could never handle responsibly or wisely. These whispers carried particular danger because they built upon genuine strengths rather than exploiting obvious flaws, praising their cooperation while subtly implying that such perfect harmony deserved rewards commensurate with its rarity, and that their collective wisdom naturally surpassed any individual authority they might encounter during their sacred mission. Most insidious was how the ring began exploiting their trust in each other to introduce what seemed like natural conclusions reached through democratic deliberation rather than external manipulation. Their shared thoughts, once their greatest protection against private temptation, became conduits for collective rationalization. As unanimous agreement began masking potential delusion, since their unity made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine consensus and the ring's patient influence over their group dynamics during vulnerable moments when collective will wavered between competing choices. Concrete manifestations of this corruption appeared in subtle adjustments that seemed prudent, meetings growing longer while pauses for reflection grew fewer, courtesy replacing the necessary friction of debate, and a growing reluctance to voice dissenting thoughts that might disturb their carefully maintained harmony. Aragorn's natural decisiveness softened into preference for group consultation that delayed action, while Sam's fierce independence eroded into protective hovering that served collective needs while diminishing the particular strengths that individual judgment traditionally provided during moments requiring swift, solitary decision. Their growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the nature of their temptations created a new form of vigilance that paradoxically made them more susceptible to influence, as constant self-examination during group discussions provided additional opportunities for the ring to insert doubts about whether their suspicions indicated wisdom or paranoia. They instituted quiet counterweights, solitary watches, rotating advocates for contrary positions, and companionless walks to restore inner perspectives. Yet the influence never vanished entirely from their carefully coordinated deliberations. This recognition that their solution had created internal challenges requiring confrontation. Before any external threat could be truly faced, would soon force them to grapple with strategic decisions that tested whether their bonds could withstand the practical requirements of approaching their ultimate destination through methods their unity had never anticipated. Their recognition that internal challenges required confrontation before any external threat could be truly faced brought them to the strategic crossroads they could no longer postpone through extended deliberation. With Isengard fallen through collective effort and Minas Tirith defended by unified strategy, the Fellowship confronted the paradox that had been building throughout their journey. How to complete a mission traditionally accomplished through secret sacrifice while maintaining the transparency that had become both their greatest strength and their most limiting constraint in approaching the fires of Mount Doom. The mechanisms of group decision-making under supernatural pressure revealed themselves as the ring learned to exploit their democratic processes with patient precision, amplifying cautious voices during council sessions and suggesting plausible delays that moved them further from direct action while appearing to serve prudent wisdom. Their commitment to unanimous consent, which had protected them from individual corruption and prevented the fractures that isolation breeds, now created opportunities for influence through the very safeguards they had established against manipulation. As reasonable arguments became indistinguishable from subtle corruption during conversations that stretched across days without resolution. Complex negotiations unfolded around their council fires, as each member struggled to balance their profound commitment to collective unity with the stark, practical requirements of infiltrating a realm designed to detect and destroy any intrusion through overwhelming surveillance and malice. Aragorn advocated for direct approach using their combined strength, while Gandalf counseled patience in exploring alternatives that might preserve their bonds without exposing them to unnecessary risk. Yet his suggestions seemed to multiply complications rather than simplify their fundamental dilemma about whether some burdens resist division without complete transformation. The fellowship instituted rotating advocates for contrary positions and appointed skeptics charged with principled dissent to counteract unanimity's seductive influence. Discovering that deliberate contradiction reopened spaces where individual wisdom could breathe beneath the weight of collective decision-making that had begun smoothing away the creative tension necessary for strategic innovation. Sam insisted that coordinated stealth remained possible, even with 9 companions, while Legolas and Gimli wondered whether their approach had fundamentally altered their mission's nature in ways requiring entirely new methods never before attempted in Middle-earth's long history of individual heroism and solitary sacrifice. Their deliberations crystallized around the recognition that their choice to remain unified had committed them to attempting something unprecedented and seemingly impossible. Entering Mordor, not as hidden infiltrators moving like whispers through shadow, but as visible symbols of hope's possibility operating within darkness itself, transforming their mission from secret sacrifice into public declaration that collective will could challenge even the heart of despair through unified purpose rather than solitary courage. As they prepared to cross into the Black Land as a complete company, the question that would soon test every assumption about power, corruption, and resistance remained suspended like gathering storm clouds. Whether their unprecedented collective presence would prove capable of disrupting the carefully maintained architecture of isolation and fear upon which Sauron's dominion ultimately depended for its terrible stability. The question of whether their unprecedented collective presence could disrupt the architecture of isolation and fear upon which Sauron's dominion depended found its definitive answer as they crossed into the Black Land, where their unified light began creating cascading changes that challenged the very foundations upon which millennia of tyranny had been carefully constructed. Within Mordor's carefully maintained despair, where hope had been systematically extinguished through generations of enforced separation and calculated cruelty, their approach as a complete fellowship introduced something the realm's foundational structures had never been designed to withstand. Living proof that cooperation without domination remained possible even in the heart of absolute darkness. The mechanisms by which their collective bond began awakening dormant possibilities in Mordor's enslaved peoples revealed themselves through what could only be termed the contagion of remembered personhood, as their example of strength achieved through mutual support rather than imposed hierarchy created fissures in systems of control that depended upon isolation, preventing any conception of alternative arrangements. Small awakenings began manifesting along their path, a momentary hesitation in an orc patrol, guards who discovered questions rising like forgotten springs, chains that met hands, pausing in recognition rather than reflexive obedience, each disruption proving that hope, when introduced as collective force into systems calibrated for loneliness, creates ripples that even concentrated malevolence struggles to contain or redirect. Their journey across the desolate plain transformed from infiltration into something unprecedented in Middle-earth's long history. A pilgrimage of unified purpose that refused concealment, turning their mission from secret sacrifice into public declaration. that collective will could challenge even the heart of despair through sustained cooperation under impossible circumstances. This visibility, which traditional wisdom would have deemed suicidal within Sauron's heartland, became their greatest weapon, as their transparent approach to bearing burden provided a counter-narrative to the philosophy of domination through division that had shaped every aspect of Mordor's social and spiritual architecture for countless ages. Yet this transformation exacted terrible costs as their collective light drew Sauron's complete attention with intensity no individual hero had ever been forced to endure, subjecting them to assaults designed not for singular minds, but for the spaces between souls, where their unity both protected and exposed them to forms of psychic pressure that tested whether bonds forged in love could withstand direct confrontation with malevolent will concentrated through ages of accumulated hatred. Their shared consciousness, which had shielded them from private corruption, now became the target for attacks seeking to fragment their collective identity through overwhelming force that made every step toward Mount Doom a deliberate act of sustained defiance. As they approached the mountain's wounded crown, their presence had begun catalyzing changes throughout Mordor's fundamental nature, awakening possibilities that had slumbered beneath centuries of enforced despair, while simultaneously creating a growing storm of opposition as forces of darkness marshaled every resource to prevent their unified approach from reaching the cracks of doom, where the ultimate test awaited. Whether collective strength could accomplish what individual sacrifice had traditionally achieved through methods their unprecedented unity had fundamentally transformed. The ultimate test of whether collective strength could accomplish what individual sacrifice had traditionally achieved awaited them within Mount Doom's fiery heart, where ancient flames had burned since the world's making, patient and eternal in their hunger for the ring's return to unmake its terrible power. As the Fellowship stood together at the cracks of doom, their unprecedented unity faced its moment of absolute trial, where the very nature of redemption would be transformed through methods that challenged every assumption about heroism, corruption, and the prices that different forms of victory exact from those who pursue salvation through shared burden rather than solitary sacrifice. The ring's final assault took an entirely different form than any corruption Middle-earth had witnessed, abandoning its perfected strategy of individual temptation in favor of what could only be termed distributed corruption. Simultaneous offers tailored to each Fellowship member, yet interconnected in ways that made resistance require not personal strength, but coordinated rejection across 9 distinct yet unified wills operating in perfect harmony. To Aragorn it whispered of kingdoms perfected through benevolent guidance that would end all suffering, to Legolas of forests restored beyond their ancient glory, where every tree would sing in eternal spring, to Gimli of mountains rebuilt in splendor, surpassing even Khazad-dûm's greatest days, each vision beautiful in isolation, yet collectively forming a web of rationalized dominion that their unity made simultaneously more appealing and more dangerous than any singular temptation had ever been. The mechanisms by which their bonds enabled them to overcome corruption that had defeated countless heroes revealed themselves, as their shared vigilance created interference patterns that disrupted the ring's orchestrated assault, each member's resistance strengthening the other's ability to perceive manipulation, where solitary minds might have succumbed to perfectly crafted illusions of righteous power and necessary control. Sam's fierce protection of simple things grounded Frodo's wavering resolve, while Merry and Pippin's clear sight of home reminded Aragorn that kingdoms exist to serve their people rather than aggrandize their rulers, creating cascading supports where collective strength multiplied individual wisdom rather than replacing it with comfortable consensus that might have masked shared delusion born from unified blindness to subtle corruption. Yet at the precipice, Frodo's failure became not individual tragedy, but collective crisis as the ring's ultimate temptation overwhelmed even their shared vigilance, his claim of ownership reverberating through their unified consciousness like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples of shared horror that threatened to shatter bonds forged across leagues of mutual trust and sacrifice. Their collective presence transformed this moment from solitary collapse into witnessed fall, where 8 companions experienced his corruption, not as distant betrayal, but as immediate spiritual wound that required not condemnation, but healing through the very unity that had brought them to this moment of ultimate testing and shared responsibility. Into this crisis stepped Gollum, driven by hunger older than memory, yet his desperate lunge met not a solitary hobbit, but the overwhelming presence of unified fellowship, whose collective light created spiritual dissonance that transformed his role from accidental catalyst into witnessed participant in a moment of deliberate mercy rather than providential accident. Their shared compassion, informed by understanding corruption's mechanisms and tempered by collective wisdom about the ring's influence, created space for mercy that individual judgment might never have achieved, allowing them to address his torment with patience that solitary heroes, clouded by immediate danger and personal stakes, had never possessed during such moments of ultimate confrontation and desperate choice. The ring's destruction through witnessed mercy, rather than accidental violence, fundamentally altered the metaphysical implications of their victory, as the method by which evil was overcome shaped the world that emerged from triumph in ways that would ripple across ages yet unborn. Their collective presence transformed even the mountain's response, as their unified witness created shared transcendence, a moment where individual identities briefly merged into something greater than their sum, experiencing victory not as separate souls celebrating together, but as single consciousness that had achieved redemption through methods challenging every assumption about power, sacrifice, and the obligations that different forms of salvation create for those who accomplish them through unity, rather than individual heroism and solitary suffering. As the ring dissolved in fires that had waited ages for this moment, their shared triumph created precedents where unified purpose had proven capable of accomplishing what tradition suggested required individual sacrifice, establishing new possibilities for cooperation while simultaneously generating expectations that future generations would struggle to meet through ordinary bonds lacking the supernatural unity their particular circumstances had forged through shared burden and mutual vigilance maintained across impossible distances and overwhelming opposition. The immediate aftermath revealed both glory and burden of their unprecedented approach, as shared success created obligations that individual heroism had never faced, binding them together through the weight of having proven perfect cooperation, remained possible, even under impossible circumstances, making them living symbols of possibilities others would spend lifetimes attempting to replicate without understanding the particular conditions that had made their achievement possible in the first place, forever changing Middle-earth's understanding of what victory could mean when achieved through collective will rather than solitary sacrifice. Their shared triumph at Mount Doom had forever changed Middle-earth's understanding of what victory could mean when achieved through collective will rather than solitary sacrifice, creating precedents that would reshape the very foundations upon which the Fourth Age would be built. With the ring destroyed through witnessed mercy instead of accidental violence, and Sauron's power broken by unified purpose rather than individual heroism, the world that emerged from their unprecedented approach carried within its liberation the seeds of entirely new forms of both possibility and responsibility that no previous victory had ever generated through such fundamentally different methods of achieving salvation. The immediate transformation revealed itself through what could only be termed the Great Restructuring, as kingdoms across Middle-earth began experimenting with governance inspired by their demonstration that perfect cooperation remained achievable even under impossible circumstances. In Gondor, scribes drafted new statutes requiring joint signatures for policies touching trade and taxation, believing borrowed structure could preserve the spirit that had ended the Shadow's dominion, while Rohan's assemblies expanded to include voices formerly distant from royal council, creating deliberative bodies that prioritized consensus over swift decree. These changes, while born from noble inspiration, revealed the fundamental challenge of translating supernatural unity into ordinary institutional frameworks that lacked the extraordinary circumstances and shared destiny that had made their particular form of collective consciousness both necessary and sustainable across impossible trials. Yet this widespread institutional mimicry created what historians would later recognize as the burden of impossible standards, where their achievement became a measuring rod against which all future cooperation would be judged, transforming natural limitations of individual capacity into perceived moral failures rather than acceptable boundaries of human fellowship under normal circumstances. Guildmasters attempted to replicate their model of shared decision-making without understanding the metaphysical bonds that had enabled such sustained harmony, leading to prolonged deliberations that often paralyzed rather than empowered communities, seeking to apply their example to mundane challenges, requiring swift action and individual accountability, rather than transcendent unity forged through supernatural guidance. The Fellowship themselves discovered that their legendary status had created a peculiar form of exile, where they remained physically present, yet spiritually isolated from ordinary relationships, with the very people they had fought to protect, as their bonds had become both beautiful achievement and subtle imprisonment that prevented natural evolution toward the independence traditionally marking great adventures' conclusions. Their unprecedented cooperation had made normal friendships feel shallow and incomplete, leaving them dependent upon each other in ways that, while profound, separated them from a world that loved them for symbolic meaning rather than understanding them as individual souls who had chosen unity over separation, at costs only they could fully comprehend through lived experience. More troubling were the subtle ways their victory had prevented certain forms of growth and wisdom that adversity traditionally granted to those who must find strength through personal struggle rather than shared support, creating a Middle-earth where the possibility of perfect cooperation had been proven, yet remained largely unattainable for ordinary beings lacking their extraordinary circumstances. Children born after their triumph showed unusual aptitudes for collective endeavors, yet displayed difficulties with solitary decision-making and independent thought, suggesting their demonstration had influenced the very nature of how new generations approached problems requiring balanced integration of both communal wisdom and individual initiative, rather than exclusive reliance on either approach alone. The mechanisms by which their example spread proved both inspiring and problematic, as communities that adapted their lessons to local customs and natural temperaments flourished through enhanced cooperation, while those attempting direct replication often produced polished sameness mistaken for harmony, creating performance rather than authentic collaboration that left ordinary people withdrawn from public participation. Aragorn's coronation, while magnificent in pageantry, carried undertones of hollow triumph, as his crown rested upon collective acclaim, rather than personal transformation earned through individual testing, leaving him to question whether authority granted through shared strength could ever match the depth of sovereignty traditionally forged through solitary battle against internal corruption and private doubt. Their victory's immediate political ramifications became apparent as various factions throughout Middle-earth began claiming their endorsement for competing visions of governance and diplomacy, turning their presence from neutral inspiration into unwitting political influence that could destabilize the very peace they had established through methods that required careful stewardship rather than partisan application. The absence of dramatic post-war devastation, prevented by their unified approach, created subtler challenges, as the lack of individual struggle for self-definition meant that some communities missed the necessary trials through which societies traditionally forge resilient character in adversity's fires. Most profound was their growing recognition that their choice to remain united had created a world where certain forms of wisdom requiring separation, certain strengths emerging only through individual testing, and certain growth demanding particular trials that unity might inadvertently circumvent through protective power, had been made more difficult to achieve through ordinary means. Their bonds, once their greatest source of strength, now carried the weight of having proven that perfect cooperation was possible, while simultaneously making such achievement nearly impossible for others to replicate without the supernatural circumstances that had shaped their extraordinary fellowship. As they prepared to navigate their roles as living symbols in a transformed world, the question that would define the early Fourth Age began crystallizing like morning frost. Whether their demonstration of sustained unity would ultimately nurture Middle-earth's growth toward greater cooperation, or create dependencies that prevented the individual development necessary for lasting peace, built upon foundations more enduring than legendary example, and bonds that ordinary souls could never hope to achieve through traditional methods. The question of whether their demonstration would nurture Middle-earth's growth toward greater cooperation or create dependencies that prevented individual development found its answer in the complex realities of what historians would later term the Age of the Exemplar, where their unprecedented unity became both beacon and burden for a world struggling to translate supernatural harmony into ordinary governance. As the Fourth Age progressed, their victory's method proved as transformative as its achievement, creating institutional expectations that honored their example while often missing its essential spirit, as communities across Middle-earth attempted to replicate perfect cooperation without possessing the extraordinary circumstances and shared destiny that had made such sustained unity both necessary and achievable through bonds forged in supernatural trial. The mechanisms by which their legend influenced governance revealed what scholars termed consensus drag, where councils and assemblies, inspired by their democratic deliberations, required unanimous agreement for decisions that individual authority could have resolved swiftly, creating bureaucratic paralysis disguised as collective wisdom that honored ceremonial balance while preventing the timely action that effective leadership traditionally required. In Gondor's expanded councils, representatives felt obligated to achieve the fellowship's level of harmony without possessing their metaphysical bonds, leading to prolonged deliberations that often masked underlying tensions rather than resolving them, while guild charters required signatures too numerous to permit necessary corrections when circumstances demanded immediate response to changing conditions. Most troubling were the psychological effects upon ordinary citizens who began measuring their personal relationships against legendary standards of perfect cooperation, finding their natural friendships and family bonds inadequate when compared to such flawless unity, creating widespread dissatisfaction with normal human connection that traditional wisdom had always recognized as sufficient for meaningful community life and personal growth. Children raised on tales of their unbroken fellowship displayed remarkable aptitudes for group activities, yet struggled with solitary reflection and independent decision-making, suggesting their demonstration had influenced developmental patterns in ways that enhanced collective capabilities, while potentially diminishing the individual initiative that balanced societies traditionally required for creative adaptation and personal resilience. The fellowship themselves experienced the peculiar burden of being simultaneously celebrated and isolated, as their bonds had become so refined through shared trials that ordinary conversation felt hollow and incomplete, transforming their greatest triumph into subtle imprisonment that separated them from the world they had fought to protect through methods that made normal relationships seem insufficient rather than simply different in character and depth. Aragorn's reign, while just and wise, carried undertones of performance as his decisions were constantly evaluated against impossible standards of collective wisdom that his royal isolation prevented him from achieving, making his authority feel borrowed rather than earned through the personal transformation that individuals struggled traditionally granted to those who claimed sovereignty. Sam's role as mayor of the Shire revealed perhaps the most poignant aspects of their altered circumstances, as his natural leadership abilities were enhanced by legendary status, yet constrained by expectations that he maintain the same level of wisdom and cooperation in mundane village matters that had been necessary during their world-saving quest, creating pressure to be perpetually exemplary, rather than humanly fallible, in ways that healthy community leadership traditionally required for authentic connection with neighbors. His attempts to establish normal relationships with hobbits who viewed him as living symbol rather than fellow gardener illustrated the isolation that comes from being loved for what one represents rather than known for who one remains beneath the weight of others' hopes and projections. Legolas and Gimli's friendship, once a source of personal joy and mutual discovery, had become a carefully maintained emblem of reconciliation that required constant public performance of harmony, their spontaneous laughter gradually replaced by measured exchanges that reassured observers of ancient prejudices overcome, while preventing the natural evolution and occasional disagreement that authentic relationships require for continued growth and deepening understanding through honest engagement with difference. Their bond, while genuine, had been transformed into political statement that served broader purposes while constraining their individual development as separate beings capable of creative tension without betrayal. The broader cultural implications became apparent as artistic expressions throughout Middle-earth began reflecting themes of collective achievement, while individual heroism gradually disappeared from songs and stories, creating what observers recognized as spiritual complacency, where the shining example of perfect unity seemed to suggest that personal struggle and solitary courage were unnecessary if one could simply achieve harmonious cooperation. This cultural shift, while preventing certain forms of conflict and division, also began to diminish appreciation for the particular strengths that individual testing and temporary solitude traditionally developed alongside communal support in healthy societies. Most significantly, their demonstration had created expectations that transcended normal human capacity, establishing standards of cooperation that required supernatural unity to achieve, yet were increasingly viewed as moral obligations rather than extraordinary achievements, transforming their beautiful example into gentle tyranny, where falling short of perfect harmony became interpreted as failure rather than natural limitation of ordinary fellowship. Communities that adapted their lessons to local customs and temperaments flourished through enhanced cooperation, while those attempting direct replication often produced polished performance mistaken for authentic collaboration, creating ceremonial consensus that honored form while missing substance. As the age of the exemplar matured, deeper questions emerged about whether their path, however noble, had inadvertently constrained possibilities for growth, that individual struggle and creative disagreement traditionally provided through different yet equally valuable forms of character development and wisdom. Their recognition that some forms of understanding might require the very separation their unity had chosen to avoid would soon lead them toward discoveries about the delicate balance between collective strength and individual flourishing, preparing the ground for insights that would define their ultimate legacy. Their recognition that some forms of understanding might require the very separation their unity had chosen to avoid marked the beginning of what would become their most profound contribution to Middle-earth's wisdom, as the Fellowship began to perceive how their extraordinary path had revealed eternal truths about the delicate balance between collective strength and individual flourishing, that governs all worlds, where love and duty intersect in complex harmony. The question that had followed them from Amon Hen, through Mount Doom's fires, could finally be answered with the mature insight their shared trials had ultimately produced, showing that their greatest gift to the world might not be their perfect cooperation, but their understanding of what such unity both enables and prevents in the intricate ecology of growth, sacrifice, and the different forms that wisdom takes when pursued through collective versus solitary paths of development. The mechanisms by which their experience illuminated these deeper patterns revealed what could only be termed the paradox of complete success, where achieving perfect harmony had demonstrated both its profound beauty and its subtle limitations, proving that some forms of strength emerge only through individual testing, while others require collective support, and that the highest wisdom involves knowing when unity serves growth and when separation nurtures development. That togetherness, however loving, might inadvertently constrain through protective intentions that smooth away necessary friction. Their journey had proven that collective will could accomplish what tradition suggested required individual sacrifice. Yet it had also revealed how different methods of victory create different obligations, different forms of wisdom, and different costs that must be acknowledged with honest reflection rather than celebration alone. Their individual responses to this understanding revealed the mature wisdom their shared trials had ultimately produced, as each fellowship member began discovering how to honor their bonds while reclaiming aspects of individual identity that collective purpose had temporarily subsumed beneath necessary unity during their world-saving quest. Aragorn learned to exercise sovereignty through personal judgment, informed by, but not dependent upon, group consensus, finding that leadership earned through shared experience could mature into authority that served collective good through individual decision-making when circumstances required swift action rather than prolonged deliberation that honored form while potentially sacrificing substance. Sam began establishing relationships in the Shire that celebrated his legendary status without requiring constant performance of exemplary cooperation, creating boundaries that allowed neighbors to decline invitations without disappointing legends, while teaching communities how to honor courage without transforming every ordinary interaction into symbolic instruction that constrained natural fellowship through ceremonial expectations. Legolas and Gimli's friendship evolved towards something more sustainable as they learned to balance their role as representatives of reconciliation with their authentic connection as individuals capable of disagreement without betrayal, their bond deepening through acceptance that perfect harmony need not be maintained at every moment to preserve underlying love and mutual respect that had grown through genuine understanding rather than performance of unity for others' inspiration. Their example began demonstrating how relationships could honor legendary inspiration while developing naturally through creative tension and occasional solitude that healthy connection requires for continued growth rather than maintenance of flawless cooperation that serves symbolic purposes while potentially constraining personal development and authentic expression of individual perspectives within loving fellowship. The broader implications of their mature perspective began influencing what historians would later term the Great Integration, where Middle-earth developed political and social structures that balanced collective decision-making with individual initiative, creating institutions that honored their demonstration of perfect cooperation while acknowledging that ordinary governance requires flexibility between unified action and independent judgment according to circumstances and the particular strengths that different approaches offer to complex challenges requiring both communal wisdom and personal courage exercised through appropriate methods. Communities that had struggled with direct replication of their supernatural unity began finding more sustainable forms of enhanced cooperation that honored their inspiration while adapting to local temperaments and ordinary circumstances that did not require transcendent bonds for effective collaboration, serving practical needs through realistic expectations rather than impossible standards. Most profound was their growing recognition that Middle-earth's greatest need had never been replication of their extraordinary unity, but integration of their insights about cooperation with renewed appreciation for the particular strengths that individual struggle and temporary solitude traditionally develop alongside communal support in healthy societies that honor both collective wisdom and personal initiative without forcing exclusive choice between approaches that each serve essential functions. They began to understand that their demonstration had value not as template to be copied, but as proof that perfect cooperation remains possible, liberating others to pursue their own forms of harmony without feeling obligated to achieve supernatural standards, while simultaneously showing that unity and separation each contribute to the larger symphony of existence through complementary rather than competing melodies. The final thesis emerged from quiet contemplation of their journey's deepest implications, that some forms of wisdom require separation, some strength comes only through individual trial, and some victories are too complete to nurture the growth they were meant to protect through methods that honor both achievement and limitation. Their perfect cooperation, while preventing immediate tragedy, had created a world that struggled with its own success, revealing how the absence of certain forms of adversity left subtle yearning for transformative experiences that collective harmony, however beautiful, cannot provide through shared burden alone without diminishing opportunities for personal development that serves communal good through diversity of insight gained through individual encounter with challenge and choice. In the end, their story became a reflective meditation on the eternal tensions between different forms of love and different definitions of victory, offering gentle insight into the profound truth that their choice to remain united had ultimately served Middle-earth by proving perfect cooperation possible, while revealing why such achievement remains extraordinary rather than ordinary, inspiring rather than obligatory, demonstrating that the highest wisdom lies in understanding when unity serves growth and when separation nurtures strength, creating harmony through balance rather than uniformity, and honoring both the bonds that sustain us and the solitude that shapes us into individuals capable of choosing connection freely rather than maintaining it through obligation or expectation that constrains the very love it seeks to preserve through different expressions of devotion and service.